Here, so many people here this afternoon. My name is Sally Warhaft. I'm here from Melbourne, which is all the more thrilling. I may never leave. I work in various places, but my heart belongs to the Wheeler Centre in Melbourne, and this event is brought to you in partnership with the wonderful Wheeler Centre for Books, Writing and Ideas. It is a complete thrill to be introducing our guest today. Anne Applebaum is an author, historian, staff writer for The Atlantic, a senior fellow at Johns Hopkins University. Her books, of course, include The Iron Curtain, Gulag, which won her the Pulitzer Prize, and her latest offering, which we're going to be talking about today, Twilight of Democracy, The Failure of Politics and the Parting of Friends. And Anne will be joining us any second now from Washington. And there you are. Hello, Anne. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I mean, virtually or spiritually or however it is that I'm there. But thank you.
It is just wonderful to see you. And look, you can't see us, so I will just very quickly set the scene for you. We're sitting in the gardens in Adelaide at Writers' Week. It is the most perfect 25 degrees, which I think is 77 Fahrenheit. It's late summer and there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people here to hear you today. So a really, really warm welcome. And congratulations on this book. It's such a different book for you. It's a personal book. It's a smaller book in size, but not in what it's taking on. Quite different to your other work. Please tell us, where did this book come from?
So you're right. It's a different book from the ones that I've written in the past. You know, when I'm writing history, or really most of the time when I'm doing journalism, I'm trying to look at a problem always from different angles, you know, tell the story of the Gulag from the perspective of the guards, from the prisoners, you know, what do the archives say? What do the memoirs say? This book is not that. This book is the result of me realizing that I had witnessed one of those big moments of intellectual transformation, that there had been an ideological change in my generation among people that I knew. And I wanted to explain it. And I realized that I couldn't explain it objectively as a historian or as a journalist because I was part of it. And I was, you know, a character in the story. And so the book is you know, it's not a memoir, but there are descriptions of some people that I know and some things that I remember, as well as interspersed with, you know, things that I've read and reflections on how events in the present echo those of the past, and how things that I lived through echo things that are happening in different places. I mean, that's the best way I can describe it. It's a bit of memoir plus a bit of history plus a bit of you know, of reflection on, you know, other times and other moments when similar things have happened. So what I lived through really was the transformation of what used to be the center right or the anti-communists, you know, in a number of countries, and I watched how some of my friends and some people I know became radicalized and became the far right, and that's the essence of the book.
Well, in fact, the book opens with a party that you held in your home in Poland in 1999, a gathering of friends, as you say, mainly from the centre-right. Can you tell us what it meant to be on the centre-right then in 1999?
So the centre-right was always a coalition. There were always different people who were in it for different reasons, just like the centre-left, I would say. And, you know, my memory of it is that if you think about who had been the anti-communists, you know, and in 1999, that group was still more or less together. You had really quite a wide variety of people. So some people were anti-communists because they were concerned about Russian nuclear weapons and, you know, raison d'etat and the balance of power in the world. And Some people were anti-communist because they were interested in democracy and human rights. And some people were anti-communist because they were religious, and the communists were atheists. And so that meant that you had a very, different kinds of people who were members of that group. But in 1999, I think all of us would have more or less said we were Democrats. We want, this is the party that I describe, and the milieu I describe was Polish, although with some English and American friends. It was celebrating the 10 years of the collapse of communism. It wanted Poland to be integrated with the rest of Europe and with the rest of the world. It was pro-NATO. It was pro-American. I mean, you could have called us Thatcherites. You could maybe have called us Reaganites, although it's a bit late for that. But more or less, it was a group of people committed to, free politics, rule of law, democracy, free markets in the broadest sense of the term. That didn't mean anything in specific, but more or less a set of liberal values. I mean, these were people who were, whether that was the word they used or not, they were classical liberals. And that's what they were in 1999, although not all of them are that now.
Certainly not, and not all of them are your friends anymore either. In fact, one of the things I noticed in the book, there's a lot of kids walking around your lot without godparents anymore. There were so many that seemed to be each other's godchildren, these awful fallings out.
A lot of estranged godparents. Yeah. I think that might be normal in all walks of life, actually.
Yeah,
but
perhaps. Yes. Yeah, the extremist godmother. Look, you write that given the right conditions, any society can turn against democracy. And indeed, if history is anything to go by, all of our societies eventually will. You focus on Poland, of course, the UK and America in this book. You touch on others. There are many others you could have included as well that come to mind. But tell us about what, with these three, were the similarities. What were the conditions that were common to these three places that transformed some of this centre-right into authoritarianism?
Funnily enough, it's a very interesting question. It's not usually posed in quite that way. I mean, normally people want to talk about how, was in Poland, was it the legacy of communism? In America, was it the legacy of the Civil War? And they mostly want to talk about how these kinds of countries are different. But actually, for the center-right, in particular those three countries, and maybe we can add a few more to it, there was a similar experience, and the experience was the experience of winning the Cold War. We won. The energy that many of us put out, against, in some cases, the intellectual consensus or the political consensus in our countries, the time we put into fighting communism. Nevertheless, we won. We were right, and there was this high that people had, after 1989. On the center right of, finally something happened, there's been a kind of victory. And after that, what happened? Try to remember what the politics of the 1990s were like. After the Cold War ended, there was this long moment of readjustment when very sensible people came to power, John Major, George Bush Sr., who were trying to put the world back together. Let's reintegrate Europe. Let's do the slow and difficult work of putting politics back together again. Let's rebuild these societies. Let's try to find some kind of equilibrium in the world. And there were a lot of very practical, pragmatic people in power at that time. And this, for a certain kind of, at that time, right-winger or anti-communist, was boring. This wasn't really what they were in public life for. This wasn't why they were in journalism. What they wanted was something, what they liked and what they thrived on was this culture war. And there were some of them, and in the book I write a little bit about Laura Ingram, who's a famous American, far-right television host on Fox News. I write about one or two people in the other countries. They felt that this world that had been created in the 90s and the 2000s wasn't interesting enough. It wasn't angry enough. It wasn't, and there wasn't a path for their kind of culture war politics. And so what they wanted was to reignite the culture war and to do that kind of shouting politics, not the pragmatic policy work that their colleagues were doing. They wanted something else. And I think you can see this phenomenon in all three countries. The aftermath of Reaganism, the aftermath of Thatcherism, and the aftermath of the collapse of communism were moments when some people felt very disoriented and bored. And that explains a lot of what moved people in a different direction. And in addition to that, there was a kind of disappointment. Is this all, after all that, this is what we have, some negotiations about, the price of raspberries in Europe, or after all that, this is what we have to just rebuild the roads of, in Eastern Poland. I mean, that's boring. And there was a category of political thinker, writer, activist, journalist who wasn't interested in that and who wanted to keep the arguments going. And that's actually what, if you want to talk about those three countries in particular, that's what the sort of the center right, the far right have in common.
And did in each of them, was a thread underlying it a terrible sort of, in hindsight, I suppose, complacency about democracy, that it was just...
There's a huge amount of complacency about democracy in all of our societies, on the left and the right. I think after 1989, after that moment when we saw all these countries, banging on the door of the democratic camp and saying, let us in, there was an assumption that democracy is something like water that comes out of a tap. We don't really have to do anything about it. It will just keep coming. We just turn it on and it comes out. And really, we neglected it. We didn't think about the institutions. Are they modern? Are they keeping up? Are we taking care of them? They didn't think about the possibility of an anti-democratic backlash. Really, in fact, what democracy is much more like water in a well. There's water in a well and it's over there and you have to go and get it. And you might have to involve yourself in it and do something if you care about it. I mean, we all got into the habit of thinking that democracy is something that professional politicians do. Some people over there who, they do that and we can just go on, I don't know, making money or writing books and we don't have to think about it. And really, actually, successful democracies throughout history, and the founders of the United States understood this very well, are countries where people are, where there is a real level of civic engagement, where people are involved in politics, where they're interested in it, where they care about it, where good people go into it, people who are talented and energetic, where it's seen as a prestigious thing to do, it's, to run for parliament or to hold public office. And in many democracies, that had really ceased to be the case. The good people went into business because that's where you could make money, or they shunned politics because it wasn't, it was somehow dirty, or and once you just leave politics to the professional politicians, then that's when high levels of disillusion arise, and that is what happened, I think, in all of our democracy. We became convinced that because it was inevitable, we didn't have to do anything. We would just, everything would just go on getting better or go on improving. And that I think was the mistake. And I hope that's a lesson that's been learned in most major democracies now.
Some of the differences in the sort of democratic institutions and structures of each of these countries, and in fact all democracies, are really interesting to me. And, you remark on the unusual reverence, for example, of the Americans for their constitution, which is, I think, a marvel to pretty much the rest of the world. But also in a country like Australia, where we have something called the Australian Electoral Commission, where all of our elections are organised without any involvement from politicians. It's a separate institution where we have compulsory voting and other countries don't. So everywhere it's a little bit different. What are your thoughts on how important are those structures and institutions within each country, or is it that the other things that engagement that you've just been talking about and so on, the quality of the people going into it, that are more important?
Oh, the institutions are incredibly important, and they are something that most people spend very little time thinking about. I recently taught a class, actually, in which I spent some time working this out. If you look at the victory of Joe Biden in the United States under the American political system with its first past the post voting and the Electoral College and so on, you got an election in which actually there was a clear victor, and that was Biden. In the House of Representatives, you also had a clear victor in terms of numbers. The Democratic Party won very easily. The Senate is harder because it's only 1/3 of the Senate is up every year. But if you look at the number of people represented in the Senate, the Democrats far outnumber they represent far more people than Republicans. Nevertheless, the American political system doesn't produce a landslide victory. It produces this very tight, narrow victory, it's not even a majority in the Senate, it's a 50-50 tie that can be broken by the vice president. And a much closer system. If you put the same electoral results that you had in the United States, even into the British system, which is quite similar, you would have a totally different outcome. You'd have Prime Minister Biden in total control of Parliament, who could pass whatever laws he wanted without worrying about the opposition. If you put that same numbers into a more consensual system, say a Norwegian parliamentary system, where you have multiple parties and you have proportional representation, then you would also have a completely different outcome. So the nature of the institutions does affect the kind of democracy you have. And the American system does encourage this. It encourages partisanship. It encourages very bitter fighting. It's created this 50-50 divide, even though the actual divide in numbers of votes is much different. And that's made politics tense in all kinds of ways. So yes, I mean, the nature of the kinds of institutions you have absolutely shape your democracy. It's a famously, you can go down a very long, dull path talking about whether proportional representation is better than this system or that system. But it's true that the failure to think about keeping up those systems and the failure to think about why in America is Congress so powerless? Why has the way our system was written, the White House wasn't supposed to be so dominant. Why has that happened? What could we do to change that? How could we restructure our voting system so that it's not so adversarial? I mean, we could have ranked choice voting in which there are, more than 2 candidates for each post. I mean, some of you will know this. The Australian system is different, so you'll have some of these things already. And the reluctance of Americans to think about that, the assumption that our system is the best because our Constitution was written in 1789 and we still have it, is one of the flaws of American democracy. I mean, you can produce better and worse outcomes, but you have to keep up with your institutions. You have to keep reforming them and thinking about them and changing them. And that means, again, that you have to think about democracy not as something that some professionals do, but something that all of us have some stake in.
While we're on America, obviously Trump, he's really hogged the stage, hasn't he, for the last 4 years in his contribution to this tale of weakening of democracy. What is his contribution, particularly around what you write about with the rhetoric of despair and moral equivalence and violence? How bad a shape is America in?
So it's very important to remember that Trump came to power on the back of a conspiracy theory about the American electoral system. So that's what birtherism was. So he came to public notice not as a millionaire with girlfriends, but as a political figure by advocating the idea that President Obama was an illegitimate president. If you remember, the argument was that Obama was born in Kenya, which was false, but and that therefore he wasn't really American and he shouldn't be president. Think about what a conspiracy theory like that really means. That means that a large percentage of Americans, something like 25, maybe 30% of Americans believed this. That means that that group of Americans believes that the entire American political system, the White House, the Congress, the courts, the police, they're all lying, because they're all supporting this false president who doesn't deserve to be in office, and they've allowed him to remain. And Trump, by building on some layers of distrust in the society and some deep, I think, anxiety about the speed of change, the direction America was going, the ways in which it was changing, by building on that, the distrust and the fear about where the country was going, convinced a lot of Americans that the political system was rotten isn't really the right word. That it was actually a lie. And during his 4 years in office, he increased and multiplied and exaggerated that feeling. So even when he won in 2016, immediately afterwards, he started criticizing the result. He wouldn't acknowledge the fact that he'd lost the popular vote. He created an electoral commission. Not many people remember this, to investigate electoral fraud, although which didn't find anything because there hadn't been any electoral fraud in 2016. And all through his presidency, he questioned the idea that there could be a fair election in the United States, right up to the very end. And he never, even before the vote happened, he never said he would concede. He never admitted that he could lose. And then obviously after he did lose, he never, to this day, as far as I know, he hasn't said, I lost. Instead, he said, okay, Biden is president, but he doesn't acknowledge that. And so that constant drumbeat of distrust, disbelief, it's not real, the system is fake. This had a big effect on the American public, and particularly on that part of the public that whose trust lies in the right-wing media that supports him. And it's created this deep fissure in the country, which isn't just it's not a political divide. It's like an epistemological divide. It's a divide about the nature of knowledge and truth itself. Did Trump win the election or did he not? Clearly he didn't. But there's a part of the country that goes on believing that. Why did that succeed? As I said, he identified and then magnified and amplified, as I said, levels of distrust, levels of disappointment, and levels of, I use the expression in the book, cultural despair. People who feel their country is going the wrong way.
And we see this in all the places that you focus on. In Poland, it was the plane crash that killed the president. And you also illuminate it with aspects of Brexit as well. Is this a necessary condition, this conspiracy sort of flaring, for the beginning of democracy to be undermined?
Yes, actually. I think it's a key component is the invention of a myth about the system having failed, or the system, and this is not just about economics, it's about the political system being a lie. And if you can undermine people's faith in that system by telling them a story that seems plausible to them, then they will begin to question, why should we abide by the result of the vote? If it's all fake anyway, and if it's all a lie, why should we obey the rule of law? Why should we, why shouldn't we storm the Capitol and attack people? It's very important that, to note that the attack on the Capitol on January the 6th wasn't partisanship. It wasn't about, those weren't Republicans attacking Democrats. Those were people attacking the system itself. They were trying to stop Congress from recognizing the next president, from certifying the results of the election. They were chanting, hang Mike Pence. They were chanting, they wanted to kidnap Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House. So these are people who have been trained now and steeped in this anti-systemic radicalism, coming from Fox News, from the Murdoch media, and from even media further to the right of that, and also, of course, increased by and multiplied and amplified by social media. And they have become opposed to, having been fed these false stories and conspiracy theories, they are now opposed to the system that they imagine as one of, that is oppressive and false.
We'll come back to the media and their role, but I'm interested that with what's happened in America, that the centre right seems to be very short of allies. It seems so vulnerable. How does it reaffirm itself? How does it build its strength back up?
So it's a little early to say. I mean, you're right that the center right, by which I assume you mean the anti-Trumpist, pro-democratic right, still exists and is represented by a few people in Congress. Representative Liz Cheney, Senator Mitt Romney, and a few others.
Even we know right all their names here. There's so few of them.
It's funny. I know it's funny. I had a funny conversation with a British friend about, and do you know all the names of the German politicians who are actually much more important in your country's politics? But everybody knows American politics, even outside of the country. I know that. But of course they seem very beleaguered, and there's very few of them. I think it's a little bit early to say how many people they represent. I mean, it may be that there are more out there than we think. Some large percentage of the United States considers itself to be moderate and independent. They call themselves independent voters, which can mean center right or center left, depending on the election and the context. And, we will find out whether that group is bigger than we think it is. I mean, there was some evidence in the 2020 election. There were enough people who voted for a Republican congressman and then voted for Biden as president, to leave some hope that there might be some Republicans who reject that kind of politics, that style of politics. And if so, they'll appear in we'll see them over the next 2 and 4 years in elections. And I mean, what you're seeing now is a kind of battle inside the party for the soul of the party. What kind of a political party is it going to be? And I'm not sure that's been decided yet.
You write that no contemporary authoritarian can succeed without the modern equivalent of the example you give is Caesar, that he had his sculptors making the multiple images of himself. Tell us about how that happens now.
So actually, my book, despite its ominous title, is not really a book about democracy as such. It's a book about journalists, political activists,
clerks,
PR people.
These clerks you describe.
I use the word clerks, which is an old word taken from a French book written in the 1920s. That describes intellectuals who work on behalf of extremist politics. Actually, I suppose that's the best way to describe it. And the people who understand and hear and feel the anxieties that the public has, and the public has a lot of reason to have anxieties, and we are living in a time of really rapid and dramatic change, and many people feel some sense of loss. The life that I knew when I was growing up has disappeared. The kind of town I'm from, is not there anymore. And they're right. I mean, there has been a huge amount of change. And there are also often people who are bothered by the cacophony and anger of modern politics, who are bombarded by information and disinformation and are looking for a clear way through it. And there is a class of people whose job it is to intuitively feel that anxiety and then to describe it and amplify it and send it back to people on behalf of authoritarian leaders. And that's, again, certain political propagandists, some journalists, some broadcasters who have thrown in their lot with radical politicians and and have become in charge of crafting their messages. I mean, as I wrote, yes, in the ancient world, they would have been making statues of Caesar, and now in the modern world, they create bot farms in order to, reproduce the President Trump's words over and over again in different ways so that they can flood everybody's Twitter feeds. I mean, I guess that's the modern equivalent of Roman sculpture. But the point is that there are people whose job it is to sell the authoritarian to people who are willing to listen to him. And that's and those people have always been with us, and they're still here. And that's the real topic of the book. And the book is, and of course, these are not the poorest people in society. They're often very well educated. They're often, wealthy by any, normal standard. And so explaining their role and what they've done and why they're attracted to authoritarianism is important, because it's a reminder that this isn't just an economic question. It has other aspects as well.
Tell us a bit more about, though, and again, what perhaps you noticed that is shared across different cultures of why elites would be attracted to this.
I mean, I don't, in the book, and more generally, I don't think there's one explanation for why people are drawn to this kind of politics. I think there are many explanations, and some of them are philosophical. People don't like the way the modern world is. They don't feel happy in it. It's somehow disappointing to them. They didn't want their country to be integrated with the world. They didn't want the kind of demographic change that they've experienced. And so sometimes it's that kind of disappointment.
And nostalgia, isn't it? That nostalgia that you write about.
Yes, exactly. And that creates a nostalgia for a different time, which isn't the kind of nostalgia that, you like visiting old churches and you are interested in history. But actually what one very brilliant Russian philosopher who I quote in the book describes as restorative nostalgia. So they become people who want not just to, be wistful about the past, but they want to restore it, actually bring it back the way that it was. But of course, that involves an act of violence, because then you have to destroy what exists in the present. And you have to, if you want old traditional hierarchies back, then you have to wreck the hierarchies of the present. And that very often requires violence or anyway, very extreme politics. And some people find that, are attracted to that extremism and the excitement of wrecking the society and rebuilding something that was better and older and more holistic than what we have in the present. Some people are attracted, though, for different reasons. I mean, there are people who are attracted to it for personal reasons. The disappointment is personal rather than political. I mean, I don't know. I thought I should be prime minister by now, or I had assumed I would have a bigger role, or I would be writing best-selling books, and I find that I'm not, or I'm treated with disdain by my, better off and more successful peers in journalism, and I want something different. I mean, that's often, you find that kind of sentiment as well. I mean, people are also attracted to radical politics because it offers an alternative career path. And there are many examples of that throughout history, starting with Lenin. I mean, if you're blocked if you're blocked by the establishment, then you often look to a counter-establishment as a way of moving forward or changing your career. So the motives are often very mixed.
You mentioned the pandemic in the book, but I wonder now that months have passed, what your sense is, or what you find interesting or possible or perhaps even frightening about what the pandemic has overlaid on all that you think about here and write about.
So, the problem with making sweeping statements about the pandemic, which everybody wants, everyone wants to hear what the pandemic will bring or what the conclusion of this strange experience is that the nature of the pandemic changes over time. And initially, in the very first few weeks and months, it did seem like the pandemic, the shutting of borders, the stopping of international travel, the fear that people felt initially, less so now everywhere, but initially this fear, seemed to be conducive to the rise of authoritarianism, because when people are afraid, then they're willing to sacrifice freedom in exchange for security or for life, and that's a trade-off that people have made throughout history. And if you look back over the history of pandemics, you find that almost always they end up, with more power in the hands of rulers. This pandemic, because of the nature of it and because of the way it unfolded, after some months, after, I don't know, 6 or 8 months, there was something different emerging, namely that it began to turn out that the countries that were doing the best, and maybe you'll have something to say about this from Australian perspective, but the countries that were doing the best and were controlling it, better than others, were often doing so because they were countries where the leadership enjoyed a lot of public trust, and where bureaucrats were trusted and public health officials were trusted and people were willing to listen to public health advice. And that actually was not that kind of trust was, you could find it in some autocracies, but you often found it in democracies too. You found it in Taiwan, you found it in South Korea, you found it in Germany. And so a lot of democracies turned out to be very good at dealing with that. And so there was also a moment when it seemed like those kinds of countries were doing well, whereas very bitterly divided countries run by populist, nationalist would-be authoritarians like America and Brazil were doing badly because their leaders had politicized the pandemic. They'd undermined faith in science. There was no public trust. People didn't know how to behave. And so you got much higher death rates. We may have a third iteration of this where, because the vaccines have turned out to be such an important, important tool in ending the pandemic. It may be that in the end, leaders are judged by that. But I do think the long-term, lesson, if there is one, is that, and this may be a lesson that's important to learn if we're going to face other kinds of natural disasters from climate change, or other worse pandemics than this one. The lesson is that building public trust and building some kind of sense of social solidarity is really as important in fighting something like this as being wealthy. America's the wealthiest country in the world with the best hospitals and the best biomedical industry, and yet it's also suffered the most deaths. And that's it's a lesson that money, science aren't enough. What you also need is a political system that builds trust, and the U.S. just doesn't have that right now.
And a good healthcare system. One of the things I thought about when I was reading your book in relation to this was that the pandemic's brought up. It was, I don't quite know how to put it, but localness. That as well as the borders all going up around nations, it went smaller than that, where a lot of the time there seemed to be little borders around neighbourhoods. And I've noticed in various spots in the world, things are popping up, like in Manchester, a new local newspaper was started called The Mill, and it's doing really well. And I'm wondering whether there are perhaps signs of something we can find of goodness or perhaps for ill, in that localness that seems to be born out of the pandemic.
Yes, I think localness, awareness of one's neighbors. There's, and I don't know if you follow this in the U.S. right now. We are doing very well at producing lots of vaccine and somehow getting it out there.
And we're not, really weirdly.
And you're not.
We're all sitting here unvaccinated. Probably no one in this audience yet has had one. So, yeah. Anyway, go on. Yeah.
No, but the one of the things that probably isn't that well known there is that in a lot of parts of the country, including the one where I live or where my parents live, the process of getting a vaccine is unbelievably chaotic.
Right.
There's 35 different websites and you have to sign up on all of them. And if you put your name on all these lists, and it's not really clear when you get it. And for a lot of older people in particular, it's very confusing, and they're supposed to be first on the list. But we don't have a national healthcare system, so it's not like in Britain where they just go down by your age and, call you up when you're ready. You have to sign up and be active. And because people are so confused and distressed by it, there have been these little pods of, there's something called the Maryland Vaccine Hunters Facebook page. And if you're a really lost 75-year-old, you can go on that page and they'll find you someone who will help you get your vaccine. And there's been a lot of that, that's a recent one, but we found it in the community where we live, I spent most of the pandemic in Poland, actually, which is where my husband was, and where we have a house. And there has been a lot of local effort to reach out to older people and help them with groceries. You do find this kind of sense, people turning to their neighbors, who suddenly your neighbor is important because they might give you this disease, or they might be suffering. And there has been I think that could be a good effect of the pandemic. If it's not counterbalanced by conspiracy theory and anger. But in some places
that's the other thing, isn't it? That it's actually given people a lot of time to sit at home connecting over the internet with like-minded people from every country in the world. Has that been a part of it too?
It made a lot of people, yeah, and also a lot of people are angry. I think there have been a number of big outbursts that we've seen in a number of different countries, including the United States last summer. Think about it. We had this extraordinary, huge protests all over the country. And although unfortunately, a few of them were violent, most of them weren't. But what was spectacular about them was the number of people who were protesting the death of George Floyd. This is the Black man who was suffocated by the police. But I couldn't help thinking, there were people chanting, here we are in the midst of a respiratory pandemic, and people were chanting, "I can't breathe." And it was so clear to me that the part of the impetus, this desire to be together and this desire to protest was coming from those months and weeks prior to that of isolation. And I think you can see it in a lot of countries, the pressure that's been put on people, the locking them up in their houses, and even in a country like Britain, which thinks of itself as super, where everybody's an eccentric and everybody, a man's home is his castle. They've really agreed to one of the harshest lockdowns in the world. And there has to be some political or sociological, maybe is the better word, reaction to that. There will be some kind of, some opposition or some, there'll be big political changes that will follow. It's very hard to say now what they will be, but opposition, a sense of that, of something new and different needing to take the place of the old world. I think you'll see that a lot in the next few years.
Anne, are you happy to take a couple of questions from our audience? You'll be able to hear it very, very clearly.
I wish I could see everybody.
I know. It's a beautiful scene. Please, if you've got a question, go and stand at the microphone just there. It is a divine scene. I'm from the city of Melbourne, which was shut down even longer and larger than the UK, I think. And for me, to be sitting here and looking at all these people you can't see, I could weep. It's such a lovely sight. So now we have a gentleman there. Would you like to go? Great.
Hello. It's good to see you here. As an Australian, I'm interested in asking you this question. What, in your view, would it take for Americans to embrace a compulsory voting system in the US? And do you think such a system would be of benefit to American democracy and politics?
Thank you.
So that's a great question. We're having in America right now almost exactly the opposite argument. What's happened in the last few weeks since the election is that a number of state Republican parties have put forward a series of laws that are designed to make voting more difficult and are clearly intended to suppress the numbers of voters. So one of the many differences between America and Australia, although I think there may be some similarities too, is that we have historically, there has been a fight over who has the right to vote. And there are some parts of the country where until the 1960s, Black people in effect couldn't vote. There have been arguments about who else is and isn't allowed to vote, who's franchised and who has the franchise and who doesn't. And so we're very far away from compulsory voting. So I don't see any political possibility of that happening. However, would it be, if I could wave my magic wand and change things and make them possible, I think it would be great in the United States. It would force, I know that in Australia, some people are cynical about it, but even to force some part of the country to take interest in it, to some kind of forcible civic engagement, I think could only be beneficial.
Australians are really.
I don't think it's possible, but it would be nice. Yeah. So.
We're hopelessly obedient in this country, which is great in times of a pandemic and in terms of voting. I recall when President Obama came to Australia when he was president. I think he left from Brisbane and he was asked by a reporter as he was getting on Air Force One, what would you like to take home, to America? And everyone just thought he was going to say the Queensland weather and he said compulsory voting. If there was anything I could take, that was his answer. Next.
Hello. My question is kind of piggybacking off what you said about Trump coming into office off of conspiracy theory and having people like Marjorie Greene in positions of power. My question to you is, what effects will including conspiracy theory in mainstream politics have on modern democracy? Yeah.
I think conspiracy theory has a huge impact on modern democracy. I mean, it's, in a way, it's not, as I said, I mean, conspiracy theory is the symptom of a larger problem. And the larger problem is this kind of described recently by a friend of mine as a epistemological crisis, meaning a crisis in the nature of knowledge. That a lot of the ways in which we once agreed about what's true and what's not true don't exist anymore or are now contentious. And whether that's the media or whether it's universities or whether it's in the case of the voting system, whether it's the people not believing in the elected Republican electoral officials were telling the truth about the nature of the vote. So all of these things have led to this this breakdown and this disagreement about what's true and what's not true. And that means it's become incredibly easy for conspiracy theorists to deliberately seek to undermine democracy through these stories that are aimed at delegitimizing the system, that are aimed at making people doubt whether their votes are counted correctly or whether the president is legitimate. I mean, these are. This is the kiss of death for democracy. I mean, democracy depends on there has to be an agreed upon area of information. If you're going to debate whether to build a highway or not, first you have to agree on whether there is a highway and, what the name of the territory is that it goes through. That's not a good example, but in order to have an intelligent conversation about where the country should go in the future, you have to have some set of common facts that you agree on. And because we no longer have that, that's the real crisis of democracy. It is very, very difficult to solve. I mean, there are people talking about different ways in which we could begin to solve it, but it's not easy.
Thank you so much.
And has Hollywood inadvertently created a lot of the lack of confidence in the political system? If you have a look at a lot of the old Rambo films and the Clint Eastwood films and Lethal Weapon, there's always, right at the critical moment, some dark force inside the government lets everyone down. Do you think that this has had an effect on undermining people's confidence?
Thank you.
That's a great question. I mean, maybe.
Yeah, and beautifully put.
Yeah. No, I mean, maybe. I mean, the question, I suppose, would be whether those films undermined the political system or whether they are reflective of people's paranoia. And, whether you see what I mean? Whether they are reflecting something that's already there or whether they have created that feeling. I mean, look, myths and legends about, dark forces undermining us. In Poland, there's this long tradition of foreigners cheating us or lying to us, and or some countries it's outsider groups. This group of people has always been untrustworthy.
You're now part of that tradition, Anne. You in the book you write about your on the personal level being part of that great tradition.
Yes, I was attacked by the Polish far right media, by state media actually, for having organized the I was accused of organizing the entire foreign press against Poland, and it was a very sweet idea. It's a nice idea that I could tell Reuters and the New York Times and Le Monde and Süddeutsche Zeitung and the Sydney Morning Herald what to write.
Superpowers.
Super powerful. I mean, my husband actually made a joke at the time. He said, "Don't tell them it's not true. Just don't deny. If they really think you're that important, then they'll eventually have to be nice to you." But I think conspiracy theory is very damaging. And as you say, the question with what is Hollywood? I mean, Hollywood reflects popular culture. It both creates popular culture, but also reflects it. So. Certainly in the United States, the fear that the government or I don't know, in James Bond movies, it's, some kind of international criminals would undermine our system or wreck us is clearly palpable. I mean, because the movies thrive on that kind of fear.
Next.
Thank you. I'm a fellow American, and I too would like to see compulsory voting in the U.S. My question is about the role of journalism to keeping the institutions of democracy integral and whole and functioning. In the case of the U.S., we had a previous president who more often strayed from the truth or made up alternative facts and alternative realities than telling the common facts. As the media, what is the responsibility to report that, to ignore that, to set it straight without amplifying the falseness? It seems a challenge.
Thank you. Anne.
It is a challenge. And I'm not sure that the media is alone able to meet it. So, I mean, the best there. I have a colleague who's a professor of journalism who says that there is a way to write about falsehood, and what you should do is create what he called a truth sandwich. So, say something that's true, then say, all right, and here's the falsehood, and then correct it again with the truth. So never publish the falsehood, publish it always in contradiction with something. And that works fine for a certain kind of audience. The problem is that journalism of the kind that you're talking about doesn't reach every audience. And there is an audience that is now deliberately rejects that form of journalism. And instead is reading mythologies and conspiracy theories. And this, by the way, is a problem in every country. This is not just an American problem. And so the deeper question, and then I don't really have a complete answer to this, is what does journalism owe that community? So do we have to try to reach them? Do we have to moderate messages so that they're palatable to them? Do we have to write in a way that will bring people together? Is that our responsibility, or should other people be doing that? Because, a lot of journalism is nowadays, as I don't really have to tell you in Australia, is very combative and divisive. And the reason for that is that's how you get readers, and people want that, and they're drawn to it and will pay for it, particularly at this difficult moment of rapid change. And so, the question is whether journalists are serving their countries or serving their readers ultimately by offering that? Should they be more conciliatory? Should they find ways of reaching multiple audiences? And those aren't easy questions to answer, because most journalists nowadays, the business model doesn't really allow for that. The business model requires you to have a loyal and devoted audience who will subscribe to your product. And so, there's a way in which even the best mainstream journalism, and there's a lot of really good journalism around the moment, actually, lots of great writers, and but even the best mainstream journalism, runs into this problem that it can only survive, if people want to pay for it, and the people who want to pay for it are one particular kind of audience.
We're very Murdoch heavy here in Australia, and at the moment, one of the unexpected unities that Murdoch has brought about is two former prime ministers, recent former, which it's quite a list, but there's one on the centre left and one on the centre right who absolutely loathed each other, have come together in an effort to try and stop this sort of onslaught. What do you say about that kind of influence in relation to the strength or weakening of democracy?
So are you talking about this fight that the Australian media and government are having with the internet platforms?
No, that's a different fight, Anne. We're taking on quite a few. No, that's a different one. No, this one is about the influence of Murdoch, in where we have whole one city newspaper towns and things like that. So I just, yeah.
The danger of having only one newspaper, the danger of having, and in particular of having broadcasters who indulge them, who are, indulge this desire that some people have to live in an alternate universe. Really can't be overstated. It is having writing some kind of rules about balance into the system, ensuring that there's real competition. Whatever it is you can do by regulation is worth doing, because once you, look, I've seen this in a completely different context. I've seen this in Poland. In Poland, there's a part of the country, mostly rural Poland, and the only real media they get, the only quality media they get consistently is state media. And when the current ruling party, which is a far right, nationalist party, took over state media and turned it into a kind of, it's very hard to describe if you're out of the country, but it really is now a kind of extremist television. It's very openly homophobic. And I don't use that word lightly. It's, they do programs on the danger of gay propaganda coming from the West. It's sometimes anti-Semitic. They run smear campaigns against particular people. And having that be the main media for a third of the country has really done a lot of damage. It's changed the way that people see the world. And being aware of the power of those kinds of monopolies. I don't want to give them too much credit, because I think people can think their way out of these things and people can become critical. And I think most people have some distance particularly towards television, in any case. But being aware as a country of the danger that can be done by a malevolent media owner and a malevolent and a company that seeks to sell disinformation for profit is really important, because once you go down that road, it's very hard to come back.
I think probably one more question. We'll see. Yeah, it'll be one more. I apologise for those of you that have missed out. Please, sir, go ahead.
Oh, hi, Anne. Welcome to Murdoch's hometown.
Yeah.
Over the last, there's been some discussion today about the slide in the public faith in representative democracy. But over the last 10 years or more, there's been a rise in the interest in use of citizen juries, citizens' assemblies, and even in the use of sortition, that is the random selection and rotation of citizens through legislative chambers. So do you see that as a hope? Is it a source of optimism?
I do. I think those kinds of projects are really interesting. And I would add, like, finding some way to, to use the internet in positive ways, to find ways to curate big conversations, which is being done in a few places. There's several projects in Taiwan where they have had, they've taken some difficult and divisive issues, and they've brought people together, and they've used conversational programs to create consensus and have people listen, force people to listen to other points of view, have been really useful. I mean, I just think there's a lot of room for really creative new ways to use the online space, to find different ways of involving ordinary people in politics that could make a big difference. I mean, absolutely, this idea of randomly selecting some people to be members of Congress or to give them roles in public life is a great one. It's very hard to convince people of the usefulness of that because they don't immediately see it. But it's funny, a lot of these kinds of tactics and techniques have been used, in post-conflict societies, in places where there's been a civil war or where there's, social breakdown. They create these national conversations and try to bring people in. I mean, I don't know why we have to wait for the civic breakdown to happen. Why can't we try some of those things, beforehand? I would really like to see some more, creative thinking about how, what should democracy look like in the 21st century? Are these 19th century systems that we created, these parliaments and so on, is this really the best way to do it? Can we think of other ways to have people involved in decision making? I mean, I'm really in favor of all of that.
Well, that is a wonderful note to end on. I wouldn't have been able to bring that optimism to the end of this story. I don't want to confect too much a sense of, the happy ending at the end of a deepened and difficult, conversation topic-wise, not, of course, with you. But that was a lovely accidental moment of hope. And it is just such a pleasure and a thrill to see you here. I'm sure everybody in the audience hopes that one day you can come and really sit under the dappled light of the trees with us in this park. But you've brought us great joy and so much to think about, and we thank you very, very much. Anne Applebaum, thank you.
Thank you. Really, I much appreciate it, and I hope to be there soon. Thank you.
Thank you. And you can all go and get Anne's book in the bookshop with an imagined signature. So thank you all very much for coming.